Right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Imperial Obituary, the Mysterious Death of the British Empire, Chapter 7, and we of Major Richard Hilton's acclaimed book, so acclaimed I can't get it in the UK still. And today I am joined by my co-host in this very long series, Connor, aka from the channel Plotlines. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's great for you to be back. And um, I'll just start off this show just quickly mentioning because I haven't streamed on my channel for a bit, and there's been as many of you know, I've I've talked about Lord of the Rings on my show and the books and predominantly, but also we have discussed in these circles, like with Nathan Hood and others, the films. And while there are problems with some of the films, there are still great moments. And unfortunately, one of the actors from that who played King Theoden, Bernard Hill, passed away a few days ago now. Um, and I'm just going to say paid tribute because he was a person who did sort of care about the story of Middle Earth and Lord of the Rings. He and his portrayal of Theoden in in every scene was top notch. And when I reread the Lord of the Rings about a year ago now, um, I actually fully understood and appreciated how much he understood the character that I don't know if any other cast member in those films um, achieved that sort of level. I mean, Faramir and Sean Astin with Sam and everything were definitely strong, but Theoden, he very much, in my mind, I don't know about you, Connor, but he very much carried the second film, which is not seen as a very popular one out of the three, but I thought his role was fantastic in the Two Towers and Return of the King, especially the famous one with the siege at Minas Tirith and the charging at the Pelennor Fields.
I agree. His part in the third one was spectacular, um, as well as I think him coming out of his basically control by Saruman was very well done, and he did a great job. And yes, he was a very good actor, though I don't know if I've ever really seen him in much other things.
Well, he was in Titanic. He's had like he's been in like the Titanic that was one I think before Lord of the Rings. He mainly did British television. There's a series that was like his breakout role. I think it was in the 80s. I can't remember what it was called now, but probably someone would comment up below. But it was about he was about this man trying to find a job in like post-industrial Liverpool, I think, or something like that. And I haven't seen it, but it'd be interesting to check out at some point. But yeah, I mean, he was someone who very much cared deeply for Lord of the Rings, and he was critical of the um, Rings of Power before he passed away. Um, for for obvious faults in it. Um, and he was very much someone who respected the law and understood how important it was to get it right because of the, and this is something that we a lot of people forget in franchises which have um, multiple complex layers. I mean, we talk about Star Wars and everything, but if we're honest, Lord of the Rings has incredibly complex layers to it. That if you were to ever be involved in any adaptation, you have to really understand it. You can't just be a like a part-time observer to it. You have to be quite deep within that knowledge. And um, you know, I think I think he said in an interview he has read he read Lord of the Rings because of his role and everything. So he had a sort of good understanding of what he was getting into. And he portrayed it excellently. I mean, it was excellent. And I will say that scene where he's giving his speech to the tens of thousands of horsemen. Whenever I feel a bit down or down the dumps or anything in the past, stick that on YouTube, and it lifts up your spirit. And then if any of you watching ever have a day where you're feeling a bit depressed, down the dumps, things not gone right at work or home or with the girlfriend, wife, or whatever, have that on, because that, no matter what mood you're in, that lifts up your spirit incredibly. But yeah, as I say, rest in peace, Bernard Hill, and glory be to the victorious dead.
I agree that that part is always moving, and just very powerful scene that I don't think you can. I don't think there's any part of it that you could critique about it. It's just incredibly well done. But are you ready for the Gollum movies?
Oh yeah, the announced today there's going to be like a spin-off Aragon. I presume was it like the first chapter of like the first chapter of the Fellowship where he's trying to find Gollum, and it's like it's a 3-hour movie of him searching for Gollum, and then when he catches him, like beating him up or something. Is that the film?
How is that a movie?
He just like 3 hour. Goodness me, there's gonna be a lot of side quests in that.
Yeah, and I'm afraid about that. Like,
Yeah.
well, they could have done one. I think it would have been interesting, at least if they did it one where he's fighting in the wars against Umbar or whatever.
Yeah, or I mean, in his younger years at Rivendell.
I just don't
Maybe
understand Gollum. Why is that the story they're going for?
I don't understand. I mean, I've always said, like, if they gave me like 80 million pounds, 80 million pounds, I could bang out a good adaptation of Beren and Luthien. I
Ooh,
could do I could do it. I could do
yeah.
it. It'd be amazing.
Well,
Just like give me 80 million pounds and like no
though
no.
I feel like you would do better with like Children of Hurin.
You know, I think it'd all go a bit too Game of Thronesy, if I'm absolutely honest with that.
Okay, then maybe I should do Children of Hurin, so it won't become Game of Thrones.
Yeah, yeah. I couldn't help myself. So, yeah. But the trouble is, it's all these studio execs and their. Or I better not say, because it's a hate crime in the UK to talk about that. But and it
Oh,
will be soon in America if they get passed through Congress. So anyway,
yes.
we better get on before we commit any hate crimes on this channel. So, um, so Connor, we talked last week. We talked about I guess effectively the expansion and consolidation, as the chapter is called, of the British Empire in India, in parts of Africa, and also expansion which in Australia, and I guess one thing that is forgotten quite a bit is the westward expansion in Canada. Um, while the United States went westward, Britain also went westward as well, but obviously not to the greater extent of population movements that appeared in the United States.
Well, they made it all the way.
Yeah, they made it all the way. And you had the boundary, didn't you? The that was agreed up. I think we're getting up to that. That might be referenced as well coming up in a future chapter. But what we're having here is the start of Pax Britannica. But as Richard Hilton said at the end, it's actually no, it's all over. It's all over. It's decline. It's all the rot is starting to set in, and hence why the thumbnail to this video is the infamous parking warden from Threads with his burnt face and his sort of mask, white mask to cover the nuclear sort of burns to his face and everything
Can you
as a
explain that
sign
to
of
me?
Britain.
What is that?
Um,
I'm not
okay,
familiar.
quick explanation for Americans. In the 1980s, there was the fear of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. A short TV film was done called Threads, and it was about what would happen to a community in Sheffield if the bombs dropped. And it showed it in its. They basically showed the aftermath of a nuclear fallout in all its grim and gory details, like what would happen to the population, what would happen to Earth, what would happen to the country. I believe America did a similar one called The Day After. There's a TV film called The Day After, which also shows what would happen to I think it's like set in one of the Midwestern states, but if if the bombs were to fall, you know. And one of the iconic scenes from that is this parking warden who's got like a rifle and it's got sort of bandages around his face and everything. I mean, that image I always thought goes hard, as the kids say. It goes hard.
Gotcha.
But I also chose it. It kind of shows me like the decline of decline of Britain as well in some way. Um,
Good thing this is a short chapter. Otherwise, if it went longer, I think I'd have to keep you alive.
yes, yes. Anyway, we'll get into it. So this is called Seeds of Decay, and we'll make a start. So what we'll do, everyone, is I'll read through it all, and then we'll all comment, and then me and Connor will comment on the end. If there's anybody who wants to put a question in chat in the meantime, please do so, and or make a comment, and we'll pick up on it as we go along. Right. So without further ado, let's get started. So chapter 7, Seeds of Decay. A mistake frequently made by those who seek for causes of shattering changes in the affairs of men is the tendency to give too much weight to material factors and to underestimate the influence of spiritual, normal, and physiological factors. Nations are not simply groups of people to be counted by the millions and assessed by that counting as though they were so many millions of sheep. Every nation worthy to be called a nation possesses a national spirit. It might almost be called a soul, and it is this spirit, far more than any material factor, which enables great things to be done. Economic resources, raw materials, financial wealth, a huge population, all these things are up to the point valuable aids to national greatness. But by themselves, they cannot produce greatness. A small nation with a stalwart heart needs, it is true, a certain modicum of material strength to let it hold its own in the world, but it does not need very much. History is filled with examples of great nations which have died completely, vanished without leaving any trace other than architectural splendors to remind us of civilizations that must have seemed in their day quite indestructible. The Chaldeans, the Medes, the Hittites, the Neolithic builders of the pyramids are among the many great nations who have left their tombstones all over the Middle East. They have left nothing else. The same holds good of the Mohenjo-Daro in India, or the stupendous metropolis of Angkor Wat in the Far East. We find the same in America, North, Central, and South, and in the remote islands of the South Pacific. There, there we find stone relics of the Toltecs, Aztecs, Incas, um, Mayas, and other civilizations whose names are not even known. All these in their day strutted as great empires of their own world. They all died, leaving little or nothing of their cultural traditions or spirit to those who inhabited the lands which they had ruled. Undoubtedly, nations can die, but the death of a nation is not inevitable. Like that of an individual, it is curious that in more recent centuries, the complete extinction of great nations has become a much rarer phenomenon than in very ancient times. The Roman Empire, though its fall was catastrophic, yet lingered on as two divided portions, one of which, in a sad mockery of greatness, may be said to have survived as the Holy Roman Empire till Napoleon gave it the coup de grace. Even so, the spirit of Rome, unlike that of the Hittites and others, has lived on till today in civilization of Western Europe. Coming to still more recent history, we find astonishing cases of unquenchable vitality in the spirit of nations. The decrepit old Ottoman Empire disintegrated at the end of the First World War, but out of the ruins sprang the virile Turkish nation of today. Still more amazing were the two revivals of Germany after her defeats in 1914 and 1945. It seems that modern nations have a residual vitality of spirit which is far harder to kill completely than that of the very ancient empires. Perhaps this may be due to the fact that national spirit today resides in the hearts and minds of many people, the patriotic elite of the nation, whereas in ancient times it only resided in the ruler himself and his bodyguards. Be the cause what it may, it certainly seems a fact worthy of general acceptance that the spirit of a modern nation ought to be and can be immortal, provided only that the nation itself does not change its basic composition. If more examples are needed, we have the rise of France after the Franco-Prussian War, and her rise again in recent years after the humiliation of 1940. We have also the example of Spain, a proud, virile nation, now on the upward grade again after a century or more of feebleness. Poland, too, is uh, a fine example of how the spirit of a nation can live on through repeated partitions of the homeland and centuries of foreign rule. What has what has all this to do with the British Empire? Simply this, that is seeking the causes of that magnificent empire's fall, we must probe much deeper than the most inquirers do. We must seek for seeds of decay in the spirit of the British nation itself, in the hearts and minds of the islanders whose ancestors established their influence and their way of life over so vast an empire. Any such probe into the changing outlook of the British nation towards its imperial destiny is complicated by the fact that a nation of many millions does not think as one man. It would be a gross oversimplification to pretend that at any period after the Spanish Armada, the entire English or later British nation thought uh, unanimously of foreign policy. This does not mean that there were always traitors within the nation, though occasionally there were. There were, however, almost always a few genuine, if misguided, patriots who sincerely believed that it was in the best interest of the country that they should oppose the official policy of king or government. During the Stuart period, these deviations were based on religious or dynastic conflict of loyalty. Later, particularly after the American succession and the French Revolution had set men's minds thinking on sociological lines, distant minorities tended towards idealistic dreams of universal peace, the brotherhood of man. Philosophers and intellectual theorists tended to oppose the military and even the commercial ambitions of governments in the belief that aggressive patriotism of that kind was a primary cause of war. It is important to remember that in the early days, at any rate, there was rarely any question of deliberate treason in the minds of these theorists. There were, in many cases, God-fearing, decent men. Cobden and Bright, for example, were men of highest principles, respected and even liked in their fiercest opponents. They formed a sort of bridge of respectability between sober-minded, middle-of-the-road men and the extremists of the revolutionary type. And yet, these decent and moderate men, and others like them, were in fact the change through which the enemies of everything British managed to pour into our nation, the ideas which have rotted the whole formerly solid structure. Biologists know that the line of demarcation between animal and vegetable life in the lowest forms of both is a very thin line. For example, decomposing vegetable matter, if left standing under certain conditions of warmth, light, and moisture, will become infested with maggots, worms, and other base forms of life and of animal life. What really happens is that the rotting matter offers a favorable breeding ground for germs or seeds of decay carried in the air or otherwise imported. So it is with the seed of decay in a formerly great nation. Every nation where free thought exists at all is composed of strata of political opinion graded from the extremes of subversion at one end to jingoistic, my country, right or wrong, at the other end. Every great nation has external enemies, and it is a natural tactic of these enemies to pump destructive poison into the more readily subversive stratum of the victim in the usual well-founded hope that this poison will seep through the middle strata, dabblers in pacifism and pink internationalism, until eventually it permeates even the intellectual of the former patriotic right wing. Just as in biology, so it is also in the history of nations. The decomposing vegetation is usually there, waiting to be germinated from outside. An investigation into the causes of decay of such an institution as the British Empire must therefore take into account the following factors: the receptive seeding ground within the British structure, the channels through which the poison is able to spread, and the methods used by our external enemies for planting the seeds and encouraging its growth. The French Revolution and the great wars resulting from it left undercurrents of discontent all over Europe. Whereas these brought about violent clashes within most of the continental countries, culminating in the year of the revolutions, 1848, Great Britain was fortunate in suffering only from comparatively mild demonstrations of unrest. The Luddites of early 19th century limited their violence and their political aims to opposing the introduction of machinery to the factories. A fear of unemployment among manual workers was the sum total of their discontent. The larger and more formidable Charterist movement certainly alarmed the authorities in 1848 by the huge rally at Kennington and its result and its threat to march on Whitehall. But their famous charter, which caused such a stir at the time, reads as an extremely moderate battle cry today. Out of the 6 demands incorporated in that document, 5 have become normal features of our present parliamentary democracy. This comparative gentleness of revolutionary movements in Great Britain have been fortunate up to a point, but it had serious and hidden disadvantages. Firstly, the benevolence of British governments as compared with the police regimes of the continent attracted to our shore large numbers of revolutionary refugees. Though in most cases they respected the law of hospitality sufficiently to detest from revolutionary violence against the land or of their adoption. It was more than could be expected of human nature that they could suppress their own political ideals. British law did not forbid exchanges of thought between one man and another, provided the law and order were preserved. So the ideas brought by the newcomers were discussed and criticised or approved by British working men. Consequently, instead of mutual fear and suspicion between law abiders and subversives producing a barrier against the flow of ideas, as happened on the continent, no such barrier rose to separate the varying degrees of militancy latent in British political thought. The effect of this abstract of rigid mentality barriers may have been slow, but in the long run, it was perhaps more harmful to the British nation as a whole than would have been the existence of a violently revolutionary element, which would have stimulated the growth of the mental wall to keep destructive ideas away from the minds of moderate men. It is significant that Great Britain was the birthplace of the Fabian brand of socialism. Founded in 1884, the Fabian Society, with its doctrine of the invisibility of gradualness, uh, proved to be far more deadly weapon against Great Britain than any bomb throwing anarchist or nihilist society could have been. The comparative gentlemanliness of subversive movements in Great Britain found a sympathetic foil in the British tendency to hear the other man's point of view. Intellectuals of leftish tendencies, here far from being repelled by more extreme radicals to the left of them, took a lively and friendly interest in the views of Charterists and others. For a long time, it was social reforms in its various aspects that provided common ground for the extreme left and the intellectual centre. Little interest were little interest was taken during this early 19th century in what modern jargon now calls colonialism or imperialism. Left-wing formers had their minds fixed firmly on the on internal affairs, the Corn Laws, the Reform Laws, and the problems in Ireland. So for half a century, empire builders and administrators quietly pursued their tasks in distant lands without interference from the misguided left wings at home. Yet through the century, like a poison spreading through a outwardly healed body, the entire structure of British political thought was slowly and surely being permeated by leftist tendencies. A notable example of this process at work was the evolution of Mr. Gladstone himself. As a young man, he entered Parliament as a Tory member of rather die-hard hue. His main speech was in favour of the continuing slavery in the West Indies. It is instructive to study his gradual metamorphosis into the distinctly radical liberal leader of late Victorian days. His case, though of interest owing to the prominence of this statesman, was by no means a peculiar phenomenon. Later, before the foundations of the Labour Party, there was a constant tendency for political opinion, whether Whig or Tory, to drift gradually leftward. At no time during the 19th century did any clear-cut distinction exist between right-wing Whigs and left-wing Tories. To confuse the issue still further, in proportion as the successive reform acts of that century gradually placed the power into the hands of a wider and less educated electorate, the two big parties tended to stretch their political creeds to the utmost in the direct most likely to attract newly enfranchised voters. Inevitably, this meant a stretch towards the left, since reactionary measures seldom appeal to uneducated men. The inevitability of gradualness was a well-chosen phase for the process which was to wreck the British Empire. It would be difficult to pinpoint the exact moment of Mr. Gladstone's career when he moved definitely from the right to left. It would be hard to say uh, at what date did the old-fashioned Whig Party become liberal. It's not easy to determine when the left wing of the party became so radical as to facilitate the formation of new political movements to the left of liberalism, to wit the Labour Party and the Independent Labour Party. A date of sorts can be given for each of these developments, but it is only the date when official announcement of change was made. The process in each of case was in perpetual and gradual. Still more difficult is it to be precise about the first infiltration of leftist ideas into the conservative mentality. It was a gradual and insidious an operation as any of those just mentioned. This in itself was remarkable because the Conservative or Tory party was, in the memory of many living today, outstanding as the patriotic party, the stronghold of those who believed in British Empire and its civilizing mission. The achievements of those who engineered this infiltration was therefore all the more deadly in its effect. Those of us who can remember typical Tory meetings of 1906 or thereabouts find it difficult to recognise in the pale pink outfit of today the Conservative Party only 60 years ago. The London School of Economics, inspired by Fabianism, was one of the implements used for this surgical operation upon the nation's political brain. Impregnation of the civil service with left-wing and eventually anti-British thought was the first success of this institution. This was an important step because of the average Englishman's pathetic trust in experts, particularly in self-styled experts. Politicians, no matter how brilliant as some of them have been, are inclined to regard themselves as amateurs in their dealings with departmental professionals. The political head of any department is, whether he realizes or not, constantly liable to be swayed by the views of senior officials if they belong to a permanent civil service. This rarely happens, curiously enough, when the cabinet minister's professional advisors belong to the fighting services. In such case, expert advice is usually disregarded or treated with deep suspicion, particularly if given by senior soldiers. These strange discrepancies in the relative trust of politicians for their military advisors probably dates from the period when Cromwell established a military dictatorship through the agency of major generals. Be this as it may, it has been unfortunate for the British Empire that our politicians' blind trust in permanent civil servants has not been tempered with a little of scepticism which they seem to reserve for fighting men. For the hand of Fabian socialism can be traced through the declining years of the British Empire. As will be seen in subsequent chapters, the rate of this decline became um, uh, precipitous during the fatal 13 years of Conservative administration, 1951 to 1964. Though there have been other and more sinister explanations for this betrayal by a political party, that there was once the backbone of patriotism and contributory cause of their own conduct maybe well have been a excessive reliance on the opinions of Fabian trained civil servants. We have then the picture of a mighty empire steadily growing throughout the 19th century, unchallenged by the open enmity of any other great power, though obviously a source of jealousy to many of them. Though the Russian Empire spreading across Central Asia towards India caused anxiety to British statesmen during this latter half of the century and involved British troops in two invasions of Afghanistan. No one occurred. No open rupture occurred between the two great powers after the Crimean War. Had temporarily foiled Russian designs upon the Ottoman Empire. War nearly came again in 1878 and 1885, but by 1907 the defeat of Russia in the Japanese War and the growing menace of Germany had reorientated Anglo-Russian relations into a triple entente with France. In similar manner, France had been regarded as a possible threat to British interests throughout most of the century. This culminated in the crisis of Fashoda, 1898, after which Franco-British relationships improved. The important point here is that during the heyday of the British Empire, Queen Victoria's reign, the balance of power among the great nations was such that Britain's statesmen misread the international uh, portents. Russia and France seem to be the principal menaces, if not indeed the only ones. The steady growth of Germany through clearly indicated by her wars against Denmark, 1864, Austria, 1866, and France, 1870, did not even begin to alarm Whitehall until the turn of the century. As far as foreign affairs were concerned, those who were responsible for watching against coming dangers had their eyes focused on two dangers spotted a minor imminence. As far as concerned international threats to the empire, namely the seeds of decay within the British nation itself, a similar misreading of the portents occurred with even more serious consequences. As a natural result of the French Revolution and the massive upheavals of the Napoleonic Wars, the rulers of Europe from 1815 till the middle of the century were obsessed with fears of great popular risings backed by lower strata of society. The year of revolutions, 1848, did in fact show that these fears were justified insofar as concerned the continental nations of Europe. Later, the utterance of Karl Marx and Engels focused the attention of the authorities responsible for security more intently than ever upon this bogey of a proletarian revolution. But, however real a menace proletarian unrest may have been on the continent, in Great Britain, even during the revolutionary year of 1848, it never was the principal internal menace. The much publicized and much feared Charterist demonstration, 1848 in London, proved to be a comparatively damp squib. More often than not, it has been the intellectual and educated classes of any country rather than the ignorant masses who have caused the downfall of existing political or social systems. Mrs. Nestor Webster, in her book The Surrender of an Empire, states that the ruling class of a country can never be destroyed unless it concurs in its own destruction. She gives many instances of this, including the French Revolution itself, and she quotes Gustave Le Bon as having said, "The people may make riots, but never make revolutions." Bit of elite theory being put in there. This is the profound truth which alone can explain one of the greatest mysteries of modern times, namely the reason why such a mighty entity as the British Empire has crumbled within the brief space of one human generation. For throughout our study of the decline and collapse, we shall find that it was the educated middle classes of Great Britain and not the working classes who first became infected with this germ of anti-patriotism, internationalism, defeatism, moral degeneracy, religious agnosticism, and similar poisons of the character and mind. Cleavage between rich and poor, noble and peasant, ruler and ruled, has never been as rigid among nations of the British Isles as among some of the continental nations. This has partly been due to our insularity, but also derives from the existence of a healthy spirit of self-respect, mutual respect among high and low. Even in feudal times, the working classes, though they may have been serfs, were never servile. English, Scottish, Irish kings were never treated by their subjects as aloof demigods, but rather as protectors of the common people against baron tyranny. Thus, despite occasional subversions, the common people of Great Britain have always been yeomen rather than proletarian in their outlook, and have usually retained a sturdy patriotism even when ruled by some social economic discontent. The undermining of the British national character, which caused this ignominious and apparently sudden collapse of British greatness, was undoubtedly the work of foreign enemies. Who these were and how they worked will be discussed in later chapters. Oh dear, I have to put a disclaimer on. Here we are concerned only with those parts of our nation that proved vulnerable to the injection of descendant thought. The Achilles heel of our nation was found among the high-browed intellectuals, sprung largely from urban and suburban families, who filled the civil and administrative services of the rapidly growing empire. It was among the stratum of society that the poison first took root, attaching itself more readily, of course, to the intellects unprotected by any strong background of patriotism or tradition. For a while, the spread of poison throughout the educated classes was hindered by the existence of a solid barrier by squelchy or English country gentry and their um, near neighbours, the farming yeomanry. These social classes represented something hardly found at all in the social structure of most other nations. Situated comfortably between the landowning nobility on the one hand and the manual workers on the other hand, and the general on the very friendly terms with both these two classes, long formed the backbone of British patriotic tradition. By British law and custom of primogeniture, only the eldest son of a noble family succeeded to the title and estates of his ancestors. England, in consequence, was spared from the multitude of princelings, counts, and minor types of nobility who overcrowded and fashionable saloons of certain other lands. Younger sons of distinguished English families had to be contented with plain Mr. and were happy to settle down as country gentlemen to raise sons of their own in the tradition of Old England. The education which these sons received was that of character rather than brain. Intellectually, they rarely attended to the scholastic standards of some of their contemporaries whose backgrounds was different, but with all their faults, the family life of the country pursuits of these younger sons produced the right sort of men to help building and maintenance of the empire. Most important still, it produced a solid phalanx and staunch patriotic sentiment, though they would rather have been seen dead than to have been heard boasting about it, which for many years served as an effective barrier to the spread of descendant ideas throughout the administrative and educated middle classes. Their near neighbours, both socially and in outlook, were the yeoman families of English countryside, just as tongue-tied in verbal expression as of patriotic sentiments. The yeomen of England were perhaps the more solid obstacle to the spread of degenerate ideas. To an observer of the British social scene in the last few years of Queen Victoria's reign, It might well have seemed that the British spirit which built the empire would be handed down from father to son forever, at any rate among the rural communities. But that observer could not have foreseen the Great War of 1814 to 1818, which wiped out the cream of England's young men, leaving their places to be filled by others worthy young men, uh, in their way, no doubt, but not so fortified by background of upbringing to withstand the insidious drip of new ideas imported from abroad and already implanted in the minds of many leftist intellectuals. As a result of the holocaust of young officers in the battle on the Western Front, the teaching profession, like all other outlets for leadership, had to fall back upon men of different type to fashion the post-war generations of schoolboys. Scholastically, the new men were probably superior to their predecessors, but they naturally could not pass on to their pupils aspects of character training which they had not themselves experienced. Their task, even had they tried to fulfill it in the old way, was rendered more difficult by the widespread questioning of religious belief which the war had brought about. Even some devout Christians found it difficult to reconcile their creed with the horrors of the trenches. The old faith was no longer implicitly held by large numbers of people whose parents had been unquestionable questioning in their faith. The decline of religious faith was not, however, entirely due to disillusionment caused by 1914 war. The first damage to Christianity's influence upon British character can be traced to the Newcastle Commission on Education in 1858 and to the series of education acts sponsored mainly by the Liberal Party, which gradually secularized state-controlled education until, in the first decade of the 20th century, the part allotted to religious teaching in state schools was reduced to almost farcical proportions. Within a generation, the results of the abandonment of this side of human education transformed the English nation from the Scots had wisely retained sound religious teachings in their school curricula, from being a devout Christian nation into an almost pagan one, for within a generation, children had received practically no religious teaching, had themselves become parents. Naturally, they were incapable of passing any religion to their children. Meanwhile, the state controlled schools had become staffed largely by school teachers of the newly adult generation, who themselves had never received any religious grounding. Naturally, abhorrers of vacuum in education as well as other spheres. The void left by the lack of religious thought was quickly filled by many of these untaught teachers by an aggressive agnosticism, which they duly passed on to their pupils. Thus, two strong barriers against degeneracy of the character had been undermined and demoralized. First, the Christian faith, the greatest of all ingredients um, of the British character in its prime, and the secondly, those old-fashioned patriots, the countrymen of England, gentry, yeomanry, and cottagers who had flocked to enlist in 1914-15 and had been decimated at Lewes on the Somme and at Passchendaele. With these props swept away, the British and particularly the English became vulnerable to every form of moral and mental poison, a contempt for all that their ancestors uh, had held sacred or noble, um, a masochistic shame for the magnificent achievement of their empire building predecessor, and a miserable defeatism which accepted almost gladly the lying propaganda of our country's enemies, who derided us a down and out nation with no hope except to surrender our independence and our very existence into the hands of foreigners. As a counterweight to these negative thoughts, our brainwashed people our brainwashed people transferred their interest to loathing some vices rightfully spurned by our forefathers. Okay, so before I continue, Connor, are you still with me?
Yep.
So, just to give a bit of a disclaimer here, Richard Hilton uses some words which are not which we can't say on YouTube. So I'm gonna have to. I wish I could say it, but we just can't say these words coming up. Okay, so I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna have to be creative with it. So if it sounds a bit out of sync, if it sounds a bit like a bit strange, that's why I'm certain words I can't use. Okay. Uh, Homosexuality, concerning which the Bible does not mince its words, been has by modern thinkers have been given the more gently name homosexuality. As such, it is defended by our bishops and other leaders of people. It is the pet theme of modern authors and playwrights, and it's given generous and sympathetic publicity by the BBC. It is surprising that a nation which has sunk so low has allowed its great empire to disintegrate. Question mark. It remains for us now to see how this poison seeped throughout our nation so insidiously and gently that for many years the giant remained outwardly as robust as ever. It remains for us to investigate who planted the poison in our midst, for nothing grows, however re- receptive the soil, unless an outside agency has planted it. Finally, we will study what must be done to restore wealth and vigor to our nation. And that is the end of the chapter, everyone.
Well done. Though I would have said the word.
I know. I don't think we can. I said I've used that word before on YouTube, and I got a strike. I nearly
Really?
said it. Yeah. You the
Could it be
um
because you're in Britain? Because I feel like I've said it and I haven't gotten anything.
yeah, you're not allowed to. I don't think you're allowed to use that term in the UK, because
That's kind of funny.
well, I say
And it,
give it a few years, mate. Well, give it a few weeks actually, because soon you won't be able to quote certain Bible verses in America.
well, I don't think that would. I don't think that's actually the law. I think it's just because something's. I mean, the whole thing is that it's defining anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism isn't going to be actually um, prosecutable. I mean, it's not a federal thing. It's more like a statement. They're more just virtue signaling at this point.
I mean, I think the Supreme Court will shut it down anyway because
Well, that
it's
too,
yeah.
but it's an awareness act. I mean, it's not a. Let me double check.
Because that's been the point of contention for a lot of Christians. Is it means that there's certain aspect. I mean, it straight up means that there's parts of the Bible you couldn't.
Well, it's definitely declaring it anti-Semitism. I'm not. I'm just saying it's more like trying to move the Overton window, shrinking it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's like.
Seeding poison. What does it matter? It's seeding poison. As Richard Hillman would say, it'd be seeding poison. You're
Well,
allowing
yeah.
poison into your country. It might not seem like a big deal now, but give it 10, 20 years, it means that effectively the Bible would be able to have like federal mandated Bible changes because there's certain passages in there which is anti-Semitic. Give it time.
Sure.
So anyway, on this chapter now, I would say this is like the most
Oh, it's a campus related thing. The only thing that would do it would be related to federal anti-discrimination laws on campuses. It's not really it's not binding on anybody in the states. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but so if you were like a Christian, if you were like a Christian
Yeah, you
sort
could
of
get kicked
community,
out of colleges um, that have federal funding, basically.
is there any? Oh, now this is a question because I don't know. Are there any? Colleges that receive federal funding do they have like theological courses on?
Yeah, There's only one college that I know of that doesn't have, or maybe not one. Maybe there are just a handful of colleges that don't accept federal funding, and many Catholic schools receive federal funding. So they obviously teach theology classes. And even all U.S. colleges have theology classes. You get a theology degree from pretty much any university. It'll be probably bad theology, but still.
So, so that my point is, then it's impossible to teach, to teach Christianity, explore aspects of the Bible, because there are certain passages in there, and there are certain parts which would be considered anti-Semitic under that bill.
Sure, but that's been the case basically even regarding other topics, not just anti-Semitism. It doesn't need to be law for universities to be firing professors and
So
would
that be like homosexuality in the Bible, that sort of thing?
Yeah, abortion, all these different things. Like just these topics will get you fired even from religious schools because pretty much every college is leftist controlled, so it's not really that different. In other words, if this bill is binding mainly on leftist campuses, that's why probably Republicans are quote unquote supporting it, because they want to squash any possibility of anti-Semitism from pro-Palestinian protests and stuff like that. I mean, basically, what we're doing is they're fighting a war. They're fighting an ideological battle in which we have no claim on. We have no. It's basically between two countries that are thousands of miles away.
Yeah, and no matter what happens, like any genuine Christian losers will effectively in the university space would lose either way. Well, you lost it, yeah. But there's no gain from there's nothing to gain from any of this, really.
Nothing to gain, just a whole lot of virtue signaling and possibly just kicking Palestinian protesters out of college, I guess. But then again, will the universities actually follow those rules? And especially if if their leadership sympathizes with the Palestinian protests anyways.
I mean, looking at, I will get back to the chapter, but on a final point, looking at some of these universities like Columbia and such, I look at the stats of the admissions of the racial backgrounds of their students, and there is a very, I mean, you got the usual diversity inclusion, but it is really overrepresentative, compared to that there is there's really overrepresentation of people, which I think might explain why there is why you have university campuses particularly involved in this series of protests. There is and in California as well, there is this really strong overrepresentation on both sides. Well, and then quite similar in this country as well. But I mean, I would say in one of my local universities where I live, I mean, there is a strong sort of Palestinian sympathy, because it's along the lines of decolonization, sort of leftist intellectual things. But at the same time, there is a strong percentage of people that are well, as you said, Connor, it's not my nations. I'm not interested. So,
Well, this. I mean, in a weird way, this came about because we're talking about an element in the book, even though we're talking about it in connection with the modern examples. But this sort of this anti-patriotism as well combining with basically foreign influences taking over the politics of a country is just it's disastrous. It's why the United States is in, is basically a laughing stock on the world stage at this point, and so is Britain.
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, let's be honest. Do you think Richard Hilton's going to name them? Do you think he's going to name them in the next chapter?
I don't know. I
I,
do
I
not know.
because when he says I'm going to name the perpetrators who introduced this poison into the country, I'm like, oh shit, Richard, are you going to name them? Is this going to be like a?
Maybe he's going to name them individually and not maybe not group them.
Maybe not, but you have to remember he does come from that generation that, well, yeah.
Oh yeah, he might.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very possible. I'm just saying that that's might
yeah.
be. Those are the two
Yeah.
possibilities, that he names them as a group or names them as individuals.
Goodness me. I think what he do is he'll name as individuals, but he'll use their last names, so you get like a you can have like a sort of clearer picture of what's
Shall we refer to them in the future as the Amish? That's what a friend of mine on YouTube has been doing, because the Amish don't use the internet, so they can't.
Good thinking. They can't get cross with us.
Yeah, they can't be upset because if we're complaining about the Amish, they didn't even know what happened.
Yeah, there's a high percentage of Amish representation in Columbia and Harvard and Princeton and everything, and again, there's talking about journalistic and banking connections of the Amish community needs to really be addressed, and also the pornographic industry. The Amish have a large number of pornographic directors and directorships in California in the Valley.
Yes,
yeah,
they
that
do
sounds
have
pretty
this
cool.
strange number of pornography organizations headed by the Amish.
And in Stonewall as well, like the homosexual movement.
But like, I mean, it's basically anything that transgresses the moral law.
Yeah.
They're it's natural rebellion for them, because the Amish have been rebelling forever since they've well, I mean, actually pretty much ever since existence, just more rebellious.
And of course, you would forget the I mean, the most classic example that's used, and people like to discredit. It's like, well, this did happen, and hence why you had the results in Spain throughout the Middle Ages, was that during the Visigothic period, when the Visigoths were, I mean, remember, this was the point when the Visigoths were no longer Arians; they were full on, Catholic in the pre-schism iteration. The gates of Toledo were opened by the Amish community, and they welcomed in the Islamic Caliphate. So, there is like these moments of like sporadic sort of spurging by the Amish, and that there's a point where you have to really wonder yourself, what. Yeah, maybe everyone else isn't the problem. Maybe the Amish, maybe the Amish, and their their inward-looking ways of not accepting outside technology is the real problem.
That was a good one.
Yeah, this is. And then maybe if they had a VW, they'd all be happy. Yeah. I'll stop now.
But yeah. Well, this is kind of interesting, because this is a sort of, this whole era of British history is very unfamiliar to me. The 1800s, for the most part.
I mean, the chapter start off. The chapter did resonate because I was aware of because you had so gives you mentioned after the Napoleonic Wars at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So you talk about like the 1820s, 30s, and into the 40s, but mainly 1820s, 30s. You had the Luddite movement, who were people who were opposed to machinery. I don't know if you had that similar movement in the United States with the sort of Industrial Revolution when it sort of reached there, like with
With the actual
factories.
Amish, you mean?
No, well, no, we were talking about the actual Amish con. I get keep up.
Sorry, with the fake Amish, I mean.
Yeah, with the no, with the well, no, with no, I'm not going to say the word with the
The,
average American.
the German Amish.
The German Amish. Yeah. Did you have any Luddite movements in North America?
Well, no, I mean literally, the Amish don't use technology.
Mm.
So I would assume that they were part of that.
Yeah, I mean the Luddite movement in England was effectively a collection of it usually resulted you had like people who would uh view technology they viewed machinery as like devilry, works of the devil, things like this. And it got to the point where you did have like because you had this when you had factories springing up that would produce um like the spinning jenny, the cotton industry, and various artisan industries became uh, you know, mechanized in these factories. Many women, in particular, were effectively out of any family profession. Of course, back then women couldn't earn money. It was all done through like a family unit. But even like on a personal level, it was you would have like these artisans that go back to effectively the beginning of time, and that created a lot of anger. And you had moments where you had riots where they attacked factories, burned down factories, attacked railway tracks. This was like um, a Butlerian jihad, if you will, of its time.
Wait, what?
There's a book called The Butlerian Jihad. Basically, it's a jihad against robotics. If you
Oh,
like a dystopian thing, Nathan Hood sort of introduced me to it. It's quite interesting. But effectively, that's your Luddite movement. And then it sort of fizzled out because it hyper normalization, right? It just it happened. The liberals made it happen, and I will say there's this. The liberals never actually won a debate. They just gaslit and killed their opponents in the UK. they, they,
what?
they just kill they just like the Whigs, right, and Tories and the Liberals, that in their governance, like any opposition to them, they just killed.
Well, has
Or
debate ever determined anything?
well, no, that's the thing. It's like that's why liberals have never actually won the debate. I mean, they're basically the same as like your Stalinists and everything, in the sense of that. It's not like they've won any debates or anything. But of course, then later on in the 1840s and 50s and such, you had the Charterists. Now, the Charterists were again a movement that was formed offshoot from like your levelers and stuff. And these were people who were largely inspired by like again post-Napoleonic War. They'd be like non-conformists, usually very ultra-Protestant, and they'd be from your working class. Well, as he said, there'd be middle classes with maybe a few sympathy from your factory workers. So effectively, they would be arguing for the right to vote and various other. I think it was like 6 codes or something they wanted to introduce, which was, the right to vote. I can't remember the others, but at the only time, remember at that time, the only people who could vote were landowning male Protestants. and so most of these people lit in their terrace houses in Victorian England, like in like up in Manchester or Birmingham, Liverpool, or wherever, or Newcastle. They were all renters, all renters. Um,
Hmm.
and of course that the liberal, they were given the reforms. Now I thought that it came under the Conservatives, but there were reforms under the Conservatives which extended the voter franchise, because this was the weird thing. The domestic servants weren't given the right to vote until a bit later on as well. So if you worked as a domestic servant in like your Downton Abbey setting, they
Hmm.
couldn't vote. That was applied later on. Um, I don't know why.
I'm
Maybe
not sure.
maybe they
I don't understand the obsession with voting. I just don't understand it.
no. Um, I think it was a way of. I mean, as they said, uh, it was pushed by the intellectual left, because what it meant was you did have in the Tory party and the small faction Liberal Party these kind of like elitist reactionary movements, but those just with the as the decades got on and you had the various reforms, uh, it that it just fizzled out. You did have a period called the Ultra Tories, which were like effectively the reactionary
Aren't they high
Tories.
Tories?
Yeah,
Or
there
who?
was an
Is
element.
there a difference between?
Yeah, high Anglican, Catholic, reactionaries, like pro absolute monarchy types, and I mean they achieved like a handful of seats, but again it came to nothing.
Wait, is there a
Um,
difference between ultra Tory and high Tory, or the same thing?
no, they're the same thing. No, the Ultra Tories was actually like a separate um political party from the Peelites, I believe. I think they split from Robert Peel in the 1800s at some point. I need to check, but I remember they were called the Ultra Tories, and they were effectively high Tories of later generation, more reactionary, aristocratic and elitist in nature, that sort of stuff. And yeah, they achieved a hand. They sort of handful of seats. I think they just quit the Conservative Party because they viewed it as being too left wing. um,
Is it common for Brits to have people? It seems like with Gladstone, just from switching parties, like politicians switching parties, because
yeah,
that's
yeah, it yeah, it is common. It is common now in particular because the I mean, like this week we've had a handful of Conservative MPs who have joined the Labour Party now. Um, as
oh
as
really?
time yeah, yeah, and the thing though is this is something Jonathan Bowden talked about in back in 2007, that as time is gradually getting on, you've had like at various different points the two main parties. So of course the Liberal Party was wiped out after the First World War as a major political force. Lloyd George, he was the last liberal prime minister. So after him, it was completely engulfed by the Conservatives and Labour, who swallowed up its voter base. Um, but in today, the two main parties, they have converged on themselves, as Bowden would put it, like political transvestitism, where um, they they are both they. I mean, the pretense they used to have of like being, the Tories being open, free market, and the Labour Party being more restrictive and everything else, and more socialistic on an economic outlook, is gone completely now. There is, I mean, the social bits never really existed for, well, since the 70s at least, to the 80s maybe, but yeah, I mean, today they are just straight up the same party. I think the only thing that separates them is it's which way the wind blows. So if the establishment which currently want Labour in, everyone can see that, and they're like, oh well, we'll just switch to Labour because we'll win at the next elections, and we'll still get our bit of money. You see, so that's how it goes. I mean, I don't know how the Democrat and the Republican Party. From my outside observation, there are still a few like Republicans who are maybe not maybe on the congressional level who are still a bit distinct from your average Democratic Party.
Well, you just don't see them
Congress.
like transferring party, going from party to another party. At least from, unless I'm missing something.
I would say that in America, there's a greater emphasis on the tribalistic of politics. So if you're like, I I imagine there are some people in America, Connor, who vote Republican no matter the candidate and vote Democrat no matter the candidate, right?
Yeah, that's probably pretty true.
Yeah. And I know, like in some cases, you have like you may have in the past you may have a Democrat candidate for governor in a Republican state like a southern state, and he or she's a bit more, you know, uh, you know, not as like wokey, not as liberal, or dare I say a bit conservative on some issues, and then they may win. It may convince a few Republicans to switch, but as time has gone on in America, that's fewer and fewer. I mean, the most recent case I would think of is that I remember looking into was the Democrat governor of Louisiana, Edward. What's his name? Edward Bell, was it, or something like that? Before I got his name wrong completely.
I don't remember.
But he ran a campaign where he still gave out the usual Democratic Party slogan, diversity, inclusion, all that sort of stuff. But then he was like, "But I'm for Christianity. I don't want to get rid of guns, and the usual stuff that Republicans like to sort of talk about now and then." And so he was able to find that middle ground and convince enough Republicans to vote for him. Obviously, but in this country there isn't. There is elements of tribalism, but it's not. It's mainly in like in your cities, university cities, where there are diehard leftists, but they're not loyal to the party. So, like in this country, there's been a revolt within the left where they don't like the Labour Party because of the stance on Palestine, Israel. They don't like Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, because he's seen as a Blairite and not a revolutionary socialist like Corbyn, and so they're backing a different left-wing party. So there isn't that political loyalty. I don't see that political loyalty. The only party that does have that is operated that is the Conservative Party, and that has really fallen apart now. So yeah, changing party.
Yeah.
Changing party, yeah, it has happened. Churchill did it a few times. He joined the Liberals and the Tories and stuff. So yeah, it has happened throughout history.
That's who I was thinking of. I mean, there are people in America that were like supported some parties, but then ran as another party. That's usually common, but not usually people like in the House suddenly becomes like a Republican. Well, they're being a Democrat. That's rare, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of like the Reform Party, like Ross Perot and people like that in America. The third party is sort of position.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, remember Donald Trump was a member of the Democrat Party up until.
Well, that's what I'm saying. But he never ran
yeah.
for anything. He never ran for anything until
No.
once So I'm saying I've seen that, but it's not usually from politicians like being elected and then jumping ship when they see the other party's going to be elected. They usually just resign in disgrace if they don't want to. If they don't want to run.
I mean, let's just say hypothetically, like I'm just trying to think of like a just imagine like a really Republican congressional district in a really Republican state. Okay.
Mhm.
Like let's just say Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example. Let's use her as an example. She's Georgia, right? That's her state.
I think so. Let me check.
Um, and I want to use it because I think her little district is quite heavily Republican. It's quite returns her with a good margin of
Yeah,
Republican votes.
probably. Yeah,
Yeah.
14th district of Georgia.
So what? Let's just say tomorrow she says, I've decided to quit the GOP and join the Democrat Party."
Yeah.
Okay. After saying and doing everything she's done, she's like, "No, I've joined the Democrat Party because the Republican Party is full of incompetent fools and so on and so forth, and Trump's a tyrant." What do you think the general reaction would be among her electorate there in in her seat?
Um, I mean, there'd be some percentage that would probably stick with her, but a large percentage would just vote for whoever is running as the Republican.
Yeah.
So it
Now
would.
in the UK, that's what's happened this week. We had the MP for Dover. She had a Conservative MP. She had quite a good, decent majority. She won it in a general election where her husband, who was the previous MP, went to prison for sexual assault.
Okay.
Okay,
Wow.
and um, and what has happened is that she's been critical. She said the Labour Party's for open borders and mass immigration. Keir Starmer's an idiot. She's been very critical of like Diane Abbott and other women of color, as I am told. She's even like been a bit spicy on sexual assault survivors on like that as well.
Okay.
And then she announced out of the blue, "Oh, I'm joining the Labour Party," and he's welcome. And it's like, uh, okay. And the reason she's joined and why a lot of others have also done that, they just joined the Labour Party and quit the Tories, is because they effectively they see the winds, the way the winds have changed, and they see the Labour Party's going to win, the Tories going to lose, and so they want, who wants to be on the losing team? Who wants to be on the losing team?
Yeah, I guess. Well, that's why most politicians over here just, resign when they think their party's going to get defeated, and then, or they think they're going to lose their seat. Not really party related, but and then they get hired at Boeing or something.
Yes.
So they don't need to. They have a better out anyways. They don't need to, stay in politics. They can just hitch their ride to some government or some not government, some company regulated by the government.
Yes.
So, also, I have to ask you a question: Is or I guess was, yes, Prime Minister accurate?
According to the according to the ministers of the day, because it was filmed in the 80s, so
Yeah.
Thatcher, like throughout the 80s. But a lot of the stories that were and the events that feature in it were from like the 70s. So it was under like um Harold Wilson's government largely.
Oh, okay.
So it was, but according to ministers and people who were in the know at the day, it was very accurate. A lot of those episodes were very accurate. Um,
Well, it just seems like I was listening to Liz Truss interview on uh, trigonometry. Sorry, trigonometry, whatever it is. And
oh
it
yeah,
it just reminded me like she is literally talking about an episode from yes, Prime Minister. And she was the Prime Minister. And she even says they would say yes, Prime Minister, and then nothing really would get done.
Yeah, that's I mean there was a good example in the paper, and I don't, usually like to read the Times too much, but there was we have this chap called Rory Stewart, and he's quite deep in like the establishment circles in the Tory party. I don't know if he's in the Tory party now. I think he's now an independent. He's no longer an MP, but he was an MP for a time, and he became a minister. And he talked about how during the events when when the West started bombing Syria. So this is when, I think this was towards the end of Obama's time um, in office, and you had the bombing of Syria, and then arms were going, and this was just before ISIS sprouted out of nowhere. Um,
Yeah, out of nowhere.
just out of nowhere, the Mossad and the CIA just dumped some weapons on the ground, and suddenly ISIS appeared. So,
Strange.
but out of nowhere, um, and he was saying how his part of his government role, I think he was like in the defense department, like a junior minister or something, and he was looking at these contracts and these weapon deals for Syrian opposition, but he couldn't find out what the oppositions were, and he was given the runaround, and it then became clear that some of the oppositions were like your Al Nusra, and these were like people who were jihadis, effectively anti-Western, um, and prescribed straight up prescribed terrorists, right? And so he had this like problem, like, hold on a sec, we're giving weapons to we're giving weapons to terrorists, and the civil servants, the permanent secretaries, permanent civil servant secretaries, effectively gave him the runaround of of a justification of why they were doing this. And so yeah, it does happen. It happens frequently.
I think you and I, maybe on my channel, should review Yes, Prime Minister.
Yeah, probably on your channel. That would be I've watched the episode. I've watched a lot of the episodes. I think I've watched pretty much all of them at this point. It's really good comedy. You have me laughing a lot. It was just be but yeah, I think that would be a good idea. One thing I do want to talk about from the chapter though is, and this is kind of an important bit, is that the relationship between the English yeoman and the aristocracy, and how that that has been the foundation of of England since the Anglo-Saxon times. I mean, that's where the term yeoman comes from, effectively. um Alderman before, I guess you would call it, they would call it, but it's the same thing. And during the First World War, the cream of English, of England, was butchered on the Western Front. And effectively, what you had was across many villages, towns, and cities, decimated male populations, and you had this. I would even call it like a biological imbalance, where you had the men who stayed at home and survived were the were the most uh, you know cowardly and Machiavellian, and this resulted, of course, in the um, I guess you could say sort of it brought degeneracy down to the masses. But the first iteration was the liberal reforms to faith in how it was taught, and especially in comprehensive schools. And this was the part of the Newcastle Commission on Education, 1858, and it was a series of education acts by the Liberal Party, uh, and effectively it was a Trojan horse to secularize teaching of Christianity. Um, and if you look at it, the way that the argument was proposed was, well, we don't want it to be too Anglican orientated. We want Catholics and Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians. You get the idea to have, so then they're not like excluded. Hence why we're going to do it, so it's going to be secularized. But in reality, it was a way of bringing up the next generation of people who had, as Richard Hilton put it, no Christian morality or ethics in their entire body, and how you had like this slowly downward spiral of you know of somebody who was I guess an agnostic, as he put it, nihilist.
Well, yeah, if you dilute any religion, you're not going to produce people, of any faith, really.
No, and it you had this, and then of course you had the when those children who were brought up without any faith because of these acts. I mean, so 1858. So if you see a 10, so you could easily have the civil service generation of those coming, well, the middle managers of those people coming through, who were, and it's important to note that, okay, those children at that time in 1858, they still had the local community. So like in the villages and towns and everything, you still had your communities and your church. So on the family home level, they would still go to like your Sunday school and church. So it wouldn't be as destructive at that time, but slowly chipping away elements of religiosity through Christianity is taken away until you get to maybe like a few generations down, maybe the post World War One period or post World War Two, and then you get to you get to like ground zero, like the worst of all, which is the baby boomers, and then it's all over. Yeah. So but I mean that's I mean the baby boomers. You're looking at what, from 1858, and this is for the UK. I'm talking about. Yeah. So it's about, within 100 years, they went from, your because Victorian society, in Britain, is always viewed as being a very stern, moderate, temperate, religious society, which was strict and upright. The stiff upper lip, this British stiff upper lip, comes from that perception of and that society, and all of that went away by the time of like the Beatles.
Did the Beatles kill society? Or was it just already dying?
Well, I think, I mean, they definitely were holding the hammer with the last nail. So, I mean, you can't blame it all on. I know people like to blame it all on the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles, they were just a symptom. Just like, I think like what is it, John Lennon? Imagine
I
no
do blame John Lennon.
Yeah, I mean, John Lennon, like, imagine no countries, no religion, no wars. Me, just me and Yoko Ono in our apartment with our Asian maids, as we treat them, as we walk around like naked, degenerate, fucking heathens.
Imagine being an idiot. That's basically what it is.
Yeah. As I say, it goes from, I mean, you end up just evolving into the most narcissistic, pathetic piece of shit on the planet. Is what you to come turn into.
Yeah, that's why baby boomers aren't going to be leaving their children money.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because they wanted to go on all the cruises and all that jazz.
I wonder if the Greeks had like their version, like the ancient people had like their version of the boomers.
Boomer with cruises. Did they have their own cruises?
Get their own casinos and retirement villages.
Wasn't it Atlantis?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that. Maybe the barbarian hordes when like sort of like a moral good for society or something.
Uh, well, is there anything else you want to touch on?
One thing that is interesting is, again, this is the other thing that I think he'll talk about a bit later on as we'll get into it, but what you had in after the Napoleonic Wars, you had this um reorganization, I guess you could say, of Europe, where Prussia was largely expanded, especially in Poland, and Russia was largely expanding. You had the Austrian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you had the sort of formations of a German and Italian state, and the borders of France. And of course, Belgium was added, so you had this formation of modern Europe, or some resemblance of modern Europe. And of course, the Ottomans were slowly being uh, pushed out of Europe in the Balkans by various independence movements in Greece and Serbia and Bulgaria and other and Romania. And on the back of all that, you had the 1848 revolutions, which resulted largely in very little change. Though what is to in Italy and Germany, those 1848 revolutions weren't necessarily just liberal; they were also quite nationalistic. You had in Berlin, Connor, you had like people who were waving the German flag as we know it today, which was a symbol of like they wanted like a united land, a united nation of German peoples, and this was effectively under Prussian uh, governance, which is what they got in the end.
Yeah,
Um,
the very ugly flag.
yeah. Um, and then you had in Italy, you had a similar thing. There was this uh, some sort of nationalistic, but it was usually done on like the three level, because in Italy you have three like cultural spheres. You have northern Italy, which is centered in Milan and Lombardy, which is quite Germanic. The Austrian Empire had presence there for some time up until the end of World War One. You then have your Bologna and Romana regions in central Italy with Rome, and then of course you have your Naples and Sicily, southern Italy, which has its own sort of identity. But you had this conquest by the Kingdom of Sardinia, and they united. Obviously, would go on to unite Italy and into one.
Oh, overthrow of the Pope and all that jazz.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Um, so there was different sort of reasons, but in England we didn't have that, and the problem was because we had this very bizarre attitude of like we like to debate and everything. I think it's because a product of our imperial splendor and sort of how wealthy high society was, that there was like these you could indulge in these bohemian sort of virtues
Feeling
that
high and mighty, maybe too.
yeah that a lot of continental socialists like your Karl Marx and Engels and other people, especially Karl Marx, who did come to the UK. He came to London. He lived in London. He's buried in London.
Yes.
Um, and I'm going to word it carefully, but
So to Louis with
um,
the Amish.
well, yeah, somewhat. But okay, so I'll try and word its entirety. In British anti-fascist circles, their their D-Day, like their winning Super Bowl final equivalent, is the Cable Street, the Battle of Cable Street, right? In the East End, London, where you had Mosley in his black shirts doing a march locally, and there's this myth that he came down from outside, marched in the streets, and the people of the East End came out and kicked that nasty fascist out of London once and for all. Okay, that's the narrative. That's the popular narrative that is ever presented in the UK. Reality was there was a large immigrant population of Amish socialists from all over the Russian Empire, including the Baltic regions. who came to the East End and were heavily involved in left-wing politics, where a lot of people who did proper East End Londoners who felt quite isolated and turned to Mosley and his guys, and there was a fight. Didn't really achieve much because they still felt atomized, and it was I think the Conservative Party won anyway in that seat anyway. But the point is, the reality on the ground was you had a lot of influx of Marxists, socialists, and communists from overseas, like from the Russian Empire and the German Empire and what have you. And that was kind of like, we really are injecting, like Richard Hillman was saying, we really are like injecting the poison. Like we should have like some sort of barrier, like the these other continental empires and kingdoms have against these sorts of people, but we didn't. And a lot of those things encouraged the birth of the modern Labour Party, which has been nothing but positive things for the UK. It birthed anti-white hatred of, or it. I don't know, the anti-white hatred stuff. A lot of it's been it's quite Americanized, but I think the anti-colonialism, which never wasn't really anti-white because it was it it wasn't sort of framed along those lines. Anti-colonialism and imperialism was also fermented. Um, Aspects of Welsh and Scottish nationalism as well, and separationism. So there's kind of like this strong victimhoodness, which comes from Irish nationalism as well. It's like this collective thing of, oh, we're so oppressed by the English, aren't we victims? We're so hard done by.
Yeah, now we get to
Um,
oppress ourselves. That's what the Irish are saying.
yeah, straight up. So that you have all this sort of aspects, and it's quite clear that these things that have been introduced, it's quite clear that it's designed to bring down Britain. Now, of course, Marx and everything, what he wanted was he wanted the proletarian to rise up in Britain. He wanted the proletarian to rise up and overthrow um, uh, the order of the day. That, of course, didn't happen, and it didn't happen because of the British yeomen, as pointed out, because they didn't understand the social fabric of British society. Unfortunately, that social fabric has been totally destroyed, uprooted, and gaslit out of existence in the UK. So, yeah, I mean, if Marx was alive today, he could run amok and probably get away with it.
I feel like anybody though back in the day would still be a little disgruntled at society.
Well, I mean,
to just some degree at least.
I mean, there's some bits that I was reading here that I was reading it and I was like, what was it? Certain aspects that he was talking about of like defending of aspects of homosexuality as a virtue, and like publicly sympathetic showings of it on the BBC. I mean, he could be talking about that today. I mean, everything on the BBC promotes some form of homosexuality or transgenderism, or something along that lines. I mean, and he's talking about that in 60 odd.
Yeah.
And I watched clips and I watched like old things from the 60s, and I mean, I guess if you look, you can see what, because then they would joke about it, but the fact that they talked about it and showed it is the subversive element, is what I think he gets at. It's like saying, oh, what do you mean, like wokeism or something? I mean, one big deal that I was promoted back in the 60s, I think, was there was on a popular soap show, there was the first like interracial kiss between a black woman and a white man. Of course, they couldn't do it the other way around because there'd be too much outrage. Um, but yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
We got a question before we head off by Disabled Cell on Twitter. He said, in response to my tweet of the Imperial obituary, the mysterious death of the British Empire, he just said, I thought it just stopped, which I think he's referring to the British Empire. He thought the British Empire just stopped for no reason at all. After winning a world war and utterly defeating the empire of the German Empire, as it was, the German Reich, the Japanese Empire, all of a sudden the victor just lost everything for no reason.
Maybe it's because they didn't really win the war.
Maybe it's because the war wasn't. No, I'll stop now. But you get yeah. As we will demonstrate, Disabled Cell, the Empire didn't, contrary to our weak education system, the Empire didn't just suddenly decide, oh no, guys, bigotry is wrong, and fascism is wrong, and imperialism is wrong. Let's all rebuild a better world together, and let's all be tied to the US economy, and let's promote like all these anti-British
British.
virtues that you all fought and died for on Normandy and in the Burma jungles. Yeah, let's do that, guys. I mean, come on, guys.
Sounds reasonable.
Yeah, it's like sounds reasonable. Yeah. I know every single guy on Dunkirk. That in their hearts they were thinking about black lesbian midgets or something.
Of course. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, I've got to head out soon, so
Yeah, we'll wrap it up now. But you know what? It's getting spicy. It's getting. I mean, his next one, he sort of tones it down a bit because it's about Pax Britannica. I think he talks about a bit more about India and Irish Americans and stuff. It's 9. It's the process of portrayal. Now that one is spicy. There are a lot of naughty words on there. You got the F word, that's a derogatory term for Irish. You got the N word, which is a derogatory term for blacks. And I think there's even a K word. That's a
what's K for? Whatever. We'll talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, there's a popular Michael Jackson song that has that K word in it. You can, was it sue me, what was it? Sue me, kill me, right? You come back me, kick me, blank me. You can never fight me. Something like that. Anyway, yeah, should be good. Okay. I will have to change that when we're reading on YouTube, of course, but you'll get the idea, everyone. Anyway, thank you everyone for watching. I will be on Hitman's channel on Saturday. We'll talk about the life of Alexander the Great. So check that out. Connor, have you got anything to promote before you go?
I'm doing a series on counter-revolution, and so there's been like four or so episodes on that topic, and it's gonna be a long series. If you compare it to something like AM's long series is on like Nations of Charlemagne, this is going to be kind of a different focus, obviously, but sort of that kind of length of a series.
Yeah, I saw the review of that French film about the counter-revolution in the Verdi, is it the Verdi?
Vendée, yeah.
Vendée region.
That episode wasn't actually part of the series. That's part of movie. Like I have a whole separate like movie or TV show discussions, but we'll be going like that was just a review of the movie. I'll eventually be going over the actual event from a historical perspective.
Yes. Yeah, so it's a very interesting sort of time period, that, but counter revolutions as well.
Mm-hmm.
And but no, anyway, thanks for coming on, and thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will catch you all next time.